Welcome to Basic Bible Studies, Lesson 7, Pondering the Gospels. One story, many dimensions. On first glance, the Gospels would seem easy to interpret. Narrative as narrative, teachings as teachings. The difficulties are in two areas. Jesus did not himself write the gospel. Jesus' primary tongue was Aramaic, and the Gospels were written in Greek. And there are 4 separate Gospels. The wording of each of the Gospels is different. Why 4 Gospels? Number 1, because God chose this format. Secondly, different communities had a need for a book about Jesus. The 4 Gospels stand side by side. They record the facts about Jesus. They recall the teachings of Jesus. They bear witness to Jesus. There are 3 synoptic common view Gospels. Mark was probably the first to be written. Matthew and Luke were written for different communities and reasons. John wrote a gospel of a different type for another set of reasons. The 4 Gospels stand side by side, with equal value. First, then, some historical context. In historical context, you want to look first at Jesus himself. What was the context in which he lived his life and his ministry and then his death and resurrection? The culture and religious setting of the first century. And for that, a lot of times there would be some outside reading that's required. Some of the religious influences that were present, first of all then, Hellenism. Hellenism is the Greek influence of the time of Christ. Alexander the Great wanted to do more than conquer the world. He wanted to spread Greek language and culture everywhere. He succeeded. Even after his empire was divided and later absorbed into the Roman Empire. The name for the spread of Greek language, culture, and thought is Hellenism, from Hellas, the Greek name for Greece. The purpose of Hellenism was at least in part political. By creating a single culture, it would be possible to govern an empire that consisted of many and diverse nations and cultures. Secondly is the Greek language. Greek did indeed become more or less the lingua franca of the civilized world. Greek culture, though mixed with local elements, gave a coherence of thought and values that persisted even after the Roman Empire swallowed up what was left of Alexander the Great's empire. Then there was the Greek culture, number 3. Hellenism was cosmopolitan in outlook. It tried to minimize local, parochial viewpoints and replace them with a cosmopolitan Hellenistic perspective. The 4th religious influence that was there would have been the Jewish resistance. Part of the Jewish population, including many of its leaders, endorsed Hellenism, while another part, especially the common man, strongly resisted it. One reason behind the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes was that he got tired of the Jews' insistence on remaining different and staying outside the more cosmopolitan culture, so he decided to force the issue, greatly underestimating the depth of the Jewish convictions. It was out of this struggle with Hellenism, which was political as well as cultural and religious, that the 2 main parties of the Judaism of Jesus' day emerges. Religious parties. The first one, party that Jesus dealt with so much, was the Pharisees. The The two main parties within the Judaism of Jesus' day were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. As Hellenism began to encroach on the religious life of the Jews, the unavoidable question was how the law of God would be applied in the new circumstances. The Pharisees took the scriptures and believed that it was their responsibility to determine how the law should be applied to new conditions and how it should, if necessary, be reinterpreted. This led to the prominence of the teachers of the law during the time between the Testaments. The Pharisees accepted both the Torah, law, and tradition, the applications of the law as taught by earlier teachers of the law. The Sadducees, by contrast, made no such effort. They did not try to adapt God's law to the new situation, but limited themselves to the 5 books of Moses. They did not even accept the authority of the prophets and of the scriptures. The Pharisees and Jesus often clashed, yet they had much in common theologically, and Jesus had many non-adversarial contacts with Pharisees. At the same time, Jesus rejected the validity of the oral laws of the Pharisees and also their emphasis on the ritual purity that made the Pharisees refuse any contact with sinners. Jesus came with the invitation to all people to enter the kingdom of God, including the Pharisees. It was especially this exclusivism that Jesus objected to in the Pharisees. By using only standards of external behavior to measure people's relationship with God, they failed to realize that it was what is inside a person that counts, and that they therefore needed God's grace as much as the worst sinner. It was this external religion that made it very difficult for them to believe in Jesus, who did not do all the things the Pharisees felt a religious person should do. So that was the Pharisees. The second religious party was the Sadducees. The party of the Sadducees consisted of wealthy priests and their friends in the aristocracy. They were religiously conservative in that they accepted the authority of the 5 books of Moses, but not of the prophets and other later writings. Thus, when they questioned Jesus about the resurrection in Matthew 22, Jesus uses a quote from Exodus 3:6, since a quote from the prophets would not have carried weight with them. At the same time, they were the group who wielded political power, which led them to endorse for pragmatic purposes some aspects of Hellenism. When Palestine became part of the Roman Empire, the Sadducees collaborated with the Romans and tried to maintain the status quo lest they lose their position of leadership. The Sadducees had more power than the Pharisees, although the common people sided with the Pharisees until about AD 70. With the destruction of the temple, the focus of their power, the Sadducees simply ceased to have any role and disappeared. The Pharisees, on the other hand, became the true leaders of the Jewish people after AD 70 by providing them with a religious life apart from the temple. The third religious party was the Zealots. The Zealots were a nationalist party that fiercely opposed the Roman occupation. One of Jesus' disciples was Simon the Zealot. Zealot may be a nickname based on his personality, similar to Jesus calling John and James sons of thunder. The fourth religious party was the Herodians. They apparently supported the Herodian dynasty and thus indirectly the rule of Rome. They joined the Pharisees in their opposition to Jesus. Some more religious parties, the leadership classes. These consisted of scribes. Scribes were not a class by themselves. In antiquity, scribes were a special class of people who copied documents and recorded information. As time went on, they became more influential and took leading roles in government. When Judah was deported to Babylonia, the people suddenly found themselves in entirely new circumstances, and it was not always clear how the law of God applied to specific new situations. This is when the scribes became interpreters and teachers of the law. They didn't know what before the exile the prophets had done, to tell the people how to live as God's people. Ezra was a scribe as well as a priest, and he took it upon himself to teach the law to the people who had returned from Babylon. When during the Hellenistic period many of the priests compromised the teachings of the law by embracing pagan ideas and customs, the scribes became the defenders of the law and the teachers of the masses. The scribes, in their zeal to protect the law, actually added to its requirements. They built a fence around the law of detailed specific commandments that would keep the people from coming even close to breaking the law. For example, the Sabbath journey, a specific distance one was allowed to walk on the Sabbath, was instituted to make sure that the people would not break the commandment to rest on the Sabbath. But as Jesus pointed out, they were so anxious to keep the letter of the law that they failed to either understand or implement its spirit. And Jesus refused to be bound by the scribal additions to the law, which earned him their enmity. The second leadership class was the priests. According to the Old Testament, a priest had to be a descendant of Aaron. The priests were divided into 24 courses or groups, each one of which served in the temple 1 week at a time, twice a year. Most priests lived outside Jerusalem. The priests who lived in Jerusalem and were connected full-time to the temple were considered far more important than the ordinary priests. The third leadership class would have been the high priests. The high priest was to be a direct descendant of Aaron, the first high priest. It was a hereditary office. During the century of independence under the Hasmoneans, the high priest was both the religious and the political leader. This led, in the end, to disaster when the office became, for all practical purposes, secular. During the Roman period, the high priest was appointed much like every other government official. From the time of Herod the Great until the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, there were no fewer than 28 high priests. Interestingly, it may be that the Jewish leaders themselves continued to view a former high priest as still having official standing even though he had been deposed, since according to the law of Moses, the high priest remained in office until his death. When Jesus was arrested, he was first sent to Annas, who had not been high priest for 15 years, and only then to Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time. The fourth leadership class was the chief priests. It's not entirely certain who the chief priests were. It is likely that they were past and present high priests, or perhaps members of the high priestly families. They may have included the priests who formed the permanent temple staff. In any event, they constituted a well-defined group. Number 5, there were the rabbis. Rabbi means my master or my Lord. It was used as a general term of respect. John the Baptist's disciples referred to John as rabbi, and his disciples called Jesus rabbi. John explains the term rabbi as meaning teacher. Jesus warned his disciples that they should not be like the professional scribes in their desire to be called rabbi. Rabbi did not become an official title until much later. The professional ordained salaried rabbi did not appear until the Middle Ages. The sixth class was those comprising the Sanhedrin. During the reign of the Hellenistic kings, Palestine was more or less self-governing. An aristocratic council of elders was in charge, presided over by the high priest. This group later developed into the Sanhedrin, which consisted of elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. During the Roman period, the internal government of Palestine was largely in the hands of the Sanhedrin, and its authority was even recognized in the diaspora. It is probable that the authorities of the Sanhedrin were limited to Judea after the death of Herod the Great, which was why the Sanhedrin could not touch Jesus as long as he was in Galilee. The Sanhedrin was abolished after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Religious institutions. The temple. The first house of God the Israelites built was the tabernacle. The first temple in Jerusalem was planned by King David and built by his son King Solomon around 950 BC. When the Babylonians overran the southern kingdom Judah in 586 BC, they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. After King Cyrus allowed the people to return to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel and Ezra, the first thing they did was rebuild the temple. The second temple was relatively plain and far less imposing than the first temple, which many of those who returned had never seen, since they had been born in Babylonia. When Herod the Great became king, one of the things he did to win over the people was to expand and beautify the temple. Since the temple stood on the top of a hill, the only way to enlarge the temple area was to build massive retaining walls and fill the area inside the walls to create a great platform. Herod doubled the size of the original platform of Solomon's temple. Part of the wall Herod built is still visible and is known as the Wailing Wall. It shows how remarkable and impressive the temple must have been. Herod died in 4 BC, almost 70 years before the temple complex was completely finished. Sadly, the finished temple stood for only 6 years in all of its splendor. In AD 66, the Jews revolted against Rome, and 4 years later, in AD 70, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. Today, the Dome of the Rock, a Muslim mosque, stands where the temple once stood. Just outside the temple area at its northwest corner, Herod the Great built a fortress and named it Antonia. The tower overlooked the temple and the temple courts and was used by the Romans to keep an eye out for disturbances in the temple area and the city. The Antonia served its intended purpose when the crowd got out of hand and was ready to kill Paul, found in Acts 21. There were 2 flights of stairs that connected the fortress called the barracks with the temple area. These are the stairs the Roman commander and his troops ran down and from which Paul addressed the crowd. The second religious institution was the synagogue. In the New Testament, we encounter synagogues everywhere, both in Palestine and throughout the Roman Empire. Wherever the Apostle Paul went to preach, he first went to the synagogue in that city. The synagogue was invented during the Babylonian exile. The temple in Jerusalem, the central place of worship for all Jews, had been destroyed. So wherever there was a group of Jews, they would get together and read and study the Hebrew Scriptures, which is our Old Testament. These meetings then were formalized in the institution of the synagogue. Unlike the temple, where sacrifices were central, in the synagogue the focus was on teaching. Any male present could be asked to read from the Scriptures, first from the Pentateuch and then from the prophet. Any male present could be asked to preach. This is why Jesus could preach in the synagogue, and later Paul also. Christian worship as well as Muslim worship is patterned after the model of the synagogue. Okay, then moving on in our historical context of the Gospels, we should first look at Jesus himself and in the knowledge of the forms of teaching that he used. We want to get the historical context. We've got to know and recognize the types of teaching that Jesus used as he was teaching. The first would have been hyperbole. Second, the Proverbs. The fourth, similes and metaphors. And we're going to be giving examples here of each one of these. The fourth is poetry. Jesus used poetry. The fifth is questions. Jesus taught by asking questions. And the sixth is one that we would use called irony. Okay, first then, hyperbole. In Matthew 5:29, Jesus said, "And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell." So Jesus is teaching someone that if his eye should offend him, that he should pluck it out. Was this actually what Jesus wanted someone to do? No, I think it was actually, he was basically saying, you've got to do what it takes. And instead of literally plucking your eye out, there's something that you need to do to show that you're serious with God, that is what you should do. So Jesus used hyperbole or exaggeration for effect to make, in this case, to show how important it was that we get our members straight. The second example that we mentioned was Proverbs. Matthew 6:21 would be a proverb. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. A proverb is a short, pithy statement with a meaning that was apparent in the statement. The third one was similes and metaphors. Jesus used many similes and metaphors many times in his parables. Matthew 10:16 says, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." As sheep would be a simile, in the midst of wolves, the wolves would be a metaphor. And wise as serpents, that would be a simile, and harmless as dove, another simile. So Jesus used many of these as forms of teaching. Poetry. "Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you." Questions. Jesus used questions. "He saith, Yes." This is Peter responding to Jesus. "And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers?" He was teaching him, Simon, an important lesson, asking him questions. And then there's irony. "He answered and said unto them, When it is evening, ye say, It will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O ye hypocrites, ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times?" Jesus used irony in his teaching. Some more on the historical context of the Gospels. Second, the particular context of a given parable or teaching. And an important tool that we want to use here in our study of the Gospels is to compare the different Gospels and these parables given in the different Gospels and help give us some context of this. Compare between the Gospels. Moving on in continuing our historical context of the Gospels. Thirdly, the historical context of the evangelist who was writing. The four Gospels had, each of the evangelists who wrote had their own historical context, if you will. The reason he wrote the Gospel. The reason he felt that he wanted to write the Gospel. Secondly, the unique perspective he had of Jesus. Each one of the Gospel writers had a unique perspective of Jesus. Matthew had this perspective of Jesus as the King of the Jews. And as you read through the Gospel of Matthew, that's where the emphasis is. Jesus was the King of the Jews. Mark, the suffering servant. Again and again, the idea of a suffering servant. Luke, the humanity of Christ. Luke is a beautiful gospel. I personally love the Gospel of Luke. It portrays the humanity of Christ, the fact that God was 100% divine, but he was 100% human as well. And Luke's perspective on humanity and of women and of suffering and of all the human side of Christ is very much pronounced in the Gospel of Luke. And then John has the perspective of Jesus as the Son of God. And this was expressly stated in the Gospel of John, often that he was writing to show that Jesus was in fact divine, or the Son of God. Okay, next, when we look at our overview of the Gospels, they were set in the Roman Empire, and in this map of Rome, circa 146 BC to 1 AD 476, we see the Roman Empire circling the Mediterranean Sea, all the way from North Africa and up around Europe and through Spain. The Holy Land. The Holy Land consisted of Palestine as a whole. There was Galilee up in the north. Galilee was a fertile area crossed by major trade routes, about 50 by 30 miles in dimension. When the kingdom of David and Solomon was divided, the northern kingdom was roughly Galilee and Samaria. When the northern kingdom fell to the Syrians in 722 BC, the population was deported to Assyria, and in its place pagan immigrants were brought in to settle the area. That is why the area is referred to as Galilee of the Gentiles. The non-Jewish element may have had a negative impact on Jewish worship and religious practices among the Galileans, who were readily identifiable by their accent and dialect. The people from Judea looked down on Galileans, as Nathanael's question shows. Nazareth, can anything good come from there? As does the sentiment that no prophet could come out of Galilee. Yet this is where Jesus spent most of his ministry. Samaria. Samaria is slightly smaller than Galilee. In Jesus' day, the population of Samaria, like that of Galilee, consisted of a mixture of Israelites who had managed somehow to escape deportation and new immigrants of non-Israelite origin. The Samaritans developed their own type of Yahweh worship based on the 5 books of Moses alone and built a temple on Mount Gerizim. There are still Samaritans today who celebrate the Passover on Mount Gerizim near the ruins of their temple. When the Jews returned after Ezra and Nehemiah, the Samaritans wanted to take part in the rebuilding of the temple, but were rebuffed. Around that time, a group of Jewish dissidents left Jerusalem and went to live in Samaria. All this led to a permanent religious and political rift between Jews and Samaritans. Jews avoided traveling through Samaria if at all possible, and it is easy to underestimate how remarkable Jesus' trip through Samaria was, as recorded in John 4, and how strong the mixed emotions were that were generated by the parable of the Good Samaritan. Next is Judea. Judea was more or less the territory of the old kingdom of Judah. It was approximately 55 by 55 miles, although its boundaries were never precisely fixed. After the death of Herod, his son Archelaus became ruler, but was banished by the Romans, who annexed Judea to the province of Syria. Judea was under direct Roman control until AD 37, when Herod Agrippa became king of Judea. Next is the Decapolis. The Decapolis was a group of 10 cities established by the Greeks in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest. They enjoyed essential independence under Rome. Near Gadara, one of the cities, Jesus allowed demons to enter a herd of swine. Jesus became popular in the Decapolis. Finally, there is Perea. Perea was a small territory east of the Jordan River opposite Samaria and Judea. Its population was primarily Jewish. In the Gospels, it was never mentioned by name, but it is referred to as the land beyond Jordan. Okay, just a few words about the diaspora. The diaspora, or dispersion, refers to the Jews living outside Palestine while maintaining their religious faith. The 2 deportations, first of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 721 BC, and then the southern kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians in 586 BC, had dispersed the Jews. Many of those who had been taken to Babylon and their descendants did not return to Jerusalem under Ezra and Nehemiah, but chose to stay. Then Alexander the Great induced many Jews to move to the newly established city of Alexandria in Egypt, and from that time on many thousands of Jews emigrated to the neighboring countries for the purposes of trade and commerce. In New Testament times, there were probably several times more Jews living outside Palestine than in it. Acts 2, 5-12 shows the extent of the diaspora. Okay, the next few, birthplace of Jesus as traditionally assumed. The reenactment, if you will, of a manger scene where the Christ child would have been born, perhaps. Another view of the cave where the baby Jesus would have been. Some modern day shepherds and a few miserable little sheep. What is traditionally known as the shepherd's field outside Bethlehem. And some sheep in that field and goats Again, the shepherd's field outside Bethlehem. The modern town of Nazareth. Another view of Nazareth. The Nazareth Synagogue. Perhaps similar to what Jesus would have gone in to teach. A view in the inside of the Nazareth Synagogue. We can imagine Jesus unrolling the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue and enjoying some popularity until he started comparing the Jews to the Gentiles and enraged the Jewish population, at which point they tried to throw him over a cliff. Sea of Galilee. View of the north end of the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River. What's remarkable about the Jordan River is not nearly as large as I would have envisioned it as a child. It is actually not all that large at all. I'm told with all the irrigation and all that goes on now, it sometimes in fact can dry up in its route from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea. This picture here is possibly close to where Jesus was baptized, in the River Jordan. Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Synagogue of Capernaum. We know the story of a demon-possessed man having his spirit cast out. The synagogue of Capernaum. Some more of the ruins of the synagogue of Capernaum. And again, down underneath the ruins is what is traditionally thought to maybe be Peter's house. We know he did live close to Capernaum, or in Capernaum. Another view of the Sea of Galilee on the shore. Most of Jesus' ministry on earth was happened around the Sea of Galilee. A net being thrown out, fishing on the Sea of Galilee. View of the Mount of Beatitudes from down below on the Sea of Galilee up toward the Mount of Beatitudes. Yet another. Looking down from the Mount of Beatitudes toward the Sea of Galilee. Yet another view of the Sea of Galilee. Traditional site of the Mount of Transfiguration, looking up toward the mountain where Jesus was transfigured before his disciples. Moses and Elijah met him there. Jerusalem, from the Mount of Olives, from the east looking west. See the Dome of the Rock there and the Temple Mount. Close-up view of the Dome of the Rock. Looking out east toward the Mount of Olives. The Golden Gate, or the Eastern Gate, which is blocked off, and as tradition has it, will again be opened when Christ returns in his kingdom. St. Stephen's Gate. building that would have been similar to the upper room where Jesus met with his disciples for his last supper. Overall view of the Kidron Valley, Garden of Gethsemane, and the Mount of Olives. The Garden of Gethsemane and the old olive trees there, where Jesus would have spent his time of agony before he went to the cross. Another view of the old olive trees. Some of them are very old. View of Jerusalem and the old city of David area. Traditional house of Caiaphas, where the Last Supper would have been held. A depiction of Peter's denial, along with the rooster, Roman soldier, and the maiden. A model of the temple and the Antonia fortress. The pavement where Jesus stood trial before Pilate. Some of those stones may be the original ones. The Via Dolorosa, narrow road where Christ bore his cross. The Damascus Gate, where he would have left the city to go out to Golgotha, where he was crucified. Rock formations that may have spawned that name, the place of the skull where he was crucified. The garden tomb. The empty tomb, Jesus' tomb after his resurrection. Okay, we've spoken at some length about the historical context of the Gospels. And now we want to wrap up our look here at the literary context and then the some hermeneutic considerations of the Gospels. Literary context. Think horizontally. When you think horizontally relating to the Gospels, you need to be aware of the parallels to a given teaching in another Gospel, to appreciate the unique nature of any of the Gospels, their emphases, to be aware of the different contexts in which the same materials lived. Secondly, think vertically. The context of Jesus and the context of the evangelist as he wrote about Jesus. Interpreting the Gospels as wholes. Each Gospel is complementary of the other Gospels, yet they stand as wholes, if you will, because of their unique nature. Two areas we want to look at there. One is an area called selectivity, what the evangelist wanted to include in his writing. And secondly, adaptivity, what emphasis each evangelist took away from the events and teachings, what impressions he particularly received of his time with Jesus. And I don't think we need to be worried that there are contradictions between the Gospels. I think that we need to understand that each Gospel writer took away different things and wrote down different things. They don't contradict. They're just a different viewpoint of what actually happened. And there are not contradictions if you look at them carefully. Okay, then some hermeneutical observations. First, the teachings in the Gospels. It's important that we understand they are for us today. They are not for some future kingdom, as some folks would tend to ascribe them to be. The teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, they're for us today. And they're possible through the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives. They're not to be relegated to some future kingdom. They are for us today. We are part of that new kingdom, not some future kingdom. Principles can be drawn from culturally exclusive commands issued to that day. For instance, the command to go the extra mile was given to the people of that day to carry a burden for the Roman soldiers, an extra mile, when they were asked to carry it for 1 mile. That principle can be carried out in our lives today, obviously not in the same way, but in different ways, to go the extra mile. The non-retaliation that's commanded, to not take revenge, to not retaliate when someone harms us in some way. The forgiveness that we are to extend to others. Jesus' commands to us describe the new life that can be lived by the power of the Holy Spirit. Finally, the narratives in the Gospels. The miracle stories. They are not set as precedents for miracles. They're simply stories of what Jesus did to show his miraculous power. They do not offer morals for us. They are vital illustrations of the power of God through his Son. Secondly, Jesus' contacts with people set forth principles. Jesus showed us God's character as he was here. Forgiveness is be one example. How Jesus forgave the sinner woman and others. And on the cross he forgave. He shows us God's forgiveness. And principles of commitment, etc. The rich young ruler. These are principles that are set, that Jesus contacts with people set forth principles for today. Thirdly, the kingdom principles that Jesus kept outlining. The kingdom of heaven is like as so-and-so, or the kingdom of God is so-and-so. That tell us of a new kingdom set up in the hearts of believers. And is rich in meaning for us today.